today with Coach Brian Hammond to talk about heat impact on athletic performance, both in a training and racing state. Get into a little bit of that in a sec. I want to start with a brief intro of Brian here. So Brian is not only Team Whoopers coach, he is also a Team Whoopers bike fitter. But I want to throw a few stats out there just so we know who we're talking to here. Brian, and you're gonna have to correct me if any of these stats are out of date, but is an 8-time Ironman finisher, 2-time Ultraman Florida finisher, which if you don't know what that is, look it up. It's even weirder. An Xterra World Championship finisher, Vermont 100-mile trail run finisher, and Leadville 100 mountain bike finisher, plus many more things. And is currently we're bothering him while he's sitting in a hotel room, ready to race the Unbound tomorrow, which is a 200-mile bike ride. So, Brian, before we jump into stuff, just as you want to talk very briefly about what you're doing, what the Unbound is, and then we'll jump into the subject matter.
Yeah, for sure. Man, all that stuff sounds great. I'm
It's
like, I
pretty
did all that. I'm like,
good.
yeah, I did a lot of that. Yeah, so the Unbound gravel race is the one I'm doing is 200 miles gravel roads. So like 95% of the roads will be pretty chunky gravel in Kansas. So the heat topic would normally be such a great topic for here. Like it could easily be 100 degrees this time of the year in Kansas. I am lucking out. Oh, so good because right now it's super cloudy and maybe like 70. So like fingers crossed. It was a little rainy. Last year was a mud fest. But yeah, it's going to be 200-mile gravel race. It's unsupported for the most part. We have two check-in points at mile 70 and then mile 150. So you got to carry everything with you that you essentially need for those things. I'm projecting my time on the bike will be somewhere between 12 and 15 hours. I really have no idea. So I'm just looking at it as like 3 5-hour chunks for the most part.
Yeah, I think I'd be out there like 3 or 4 days at this point. So,
Well, there is a 350 version, which actually they take off 3 o'clock this afternoon, and it's completely unsupported. Like they just got to stop in towns and stuff like that and
yeah.
refuel, but they'll be riding all night long.
Okay. All right. Well, a very accomplished endurance athlete here in Brian Hammond. So very appreciative you took a little time out of your schedule here, and we'll jump in on heat. As you mentioned, I think is very obviously topical as we come into warm weather. This is going to be something even at 70 you're going to be dealing with, over the course of the next like 24 hours here. So I want to start with, and if you don't mind, doing maybe a little bit of an overview on some of the physical characteristics and like the negative performance traits that kind of heat impacts on your body, like how your body is actually responding to this new stimulus of warmer weather.
Yeah, so it's actually really simple when you kind of think about this. Is we have an internal body temperature, right, with 98 degrees or whatever it is. And the fact of the matter is as long as our body temperature is staying the same, we're good. We're golden. The body's going to keep working the way it's going to work. The problem comes into is when that body temperature gets out of our norm, whether too low, hypothermia, obviously freezing to death would not be good. And then what we're talking about today is getting too high, right? So that internal body temperature starts to rise. Essentially, your body's going to try to save itself, and the way it saves itself is by shutting things down. It's just going to slow you down, right? So when you're thinking about like the impact that heat has on us, it's simply just going to affect, hopefully it's just going to affect our performances. Like you're just not going to perform in heat the way that you would in an ideal 60-degree, 55-degree day. And there's so many other things that kind of affect that is, as we work harder, we produce more heat internally, right? Our muscles are not the most efficient energy system or, motors essentially, right? Every motor has some sort of exhaust. Our muscles
Yep.
are like 20% efficiency. Like they're not good at all. Creating ATP takes combustion and that creates heat essentially.
Fair. So I think pretty like high level, elevated core temperature, et cetera, body warming up, unable to cool down. That's kind of where 99% of our problems lie there. So Let's think about, so I'm going to break this into kind of training and racing because I'll be interested to hear. We haven't talked about this. I'll be interested to hear just your opinions and if they differ at all. But start on a training capacity. So this time of year, we're kind of going into peak cycling season. Most places in the country, not everywhere. So most places, we're going into the bulk of marathon training season here in like the days and weeks to follow. So even though temperatures are elevating, this is really where people are getting their biggest, longest, hardest, most complicated workouts in over the training year. So starting on a training perspective, when you're coming in either personally or with your athletes to the season, what are you thinking about? What are you talking about in terms of like modifying the workouts themselves?
Yeah, it's I will back up a little bit and get a little more detail, just like how our body responds in the heat and stuff like that,
Mhm.
because it'll make this kind of make a little bit more sense, right? So cycling and running are very similar in the fact of how our body's going to generate heat, right? We're working muscles, so we're gonna generate heat. How we dispose of heat is different between the two. I mean, our body's going to obviously do the same things of sweating and stuff like that, but cyclists have an advantage in the heat aspect, in the fact that you know we have air that's constantly blowing across us. If I'm traveling 20 miles an hour on my bike, I'm
Mhm.
having wind 20 miles an hour crossing my skin, helping that convection, that cooling aspect of blowing the heat off of me. Where a runner, you know, even if you're running at a good clip, I mean, you're running 6 miles an hour, 7 miles an hour, 5 miles an hour, like it's not that much
Mhm.
airflow coming over
Yeah.
top of your body that's going to help in that cooling aspect, right? So runners have that disadvantage over cyclists, as well as most of us, if you're a multi sport athlete or play around with both, we also realize like our heart rate's typically higher running than it is at the same effort cycling, right? So
Sure.
that heart rate also means that my body's working harder, which is also generating more heat as well. So runners are definitely at a huge disadvantage in this aspect, where the cyclists have a little bit more going for us. The
Mhm.
fact that we have wind and probably not working as hard. The other thing that you really kind of take in consideration with training, especially, so when I'm looking at my athletes or I'm looking at my own schedule for the year, is heat, am I going to be racing in a heat situation? Is this something I'm going to have to deal with? And when am I going to have to deal with this? We live in the Northeast. A lot of people might go do Ironman Texas in, May, where they're not ready for the heat. They've
Mhm.
been living in 50-degree weather, no humidity and all this stuff, and now they're going to be in this heat box and their body's not ready for it yet. So number one is just kind of mapping that out. Like, is it smart to be racing that? Am I setting
Mhm.
myself up for success at all in that situation?
Yeah.
So being smart, selecting the events you're going to do, but sometimes it's out of our control and we're just going to race what we're going to race. So then you got to get into like, how do we prepare for it? Right. So when I'm looking at a training day, for example, and I know it's going to be hot. We're getting into New York City. It's getting hot and all that stuff. The first thing I want to do is I want to make sure I curb my expectations, right? Like, am I going out to do a
Yep.
track work when it's
Yep.
100% humidity outside and 95 degrees outside? Like, absolutely not, right? So that's going to be my easy day for the most part. And so understanding the type of performance I'm going to try to do probably comes in first.
Mhm.
Secondarily, I'm really going to start to think about my hydration, not during, I mean, definitely during, but really prior to, right? Drinking
Yep.
for the days leading up to make sure that that water is in there. Type of clothes that I'm wearing, making sure that they're breathable, wicking type stuff like that. Location is also super important, right? So one of the things that we think about is radiant heat, being in the sun,
Mhm.
right? You stand in the sun. If the air temperature or the sun is beating on you, you can't dissipate heat. It's hotter than you are.
Sure.
So I can't send my heat, right? If anything, I'm absorbing that heat. So is it shaded, right? And for those of us that live in New York City, we also understand that there's also a reflective radiant heat, Walk
Hmm.
around in New York in August, the heat is coming up from the ground, literally coming up from the pavement, right? So what type of surface am I running on or riding on?
Hmm.
Am I picking a pavement or am I picking grass, a rubberized track? What's the heat aspect of that that's going to pop up on me? So these are all kind of thoughts that I'm going to have going into this as far as like how do I set myself up for success for this training session and how do I mitigate the chances of my body temperature getting too high?
Sure.
But definitely
Yeah.
expectations got to be number one. Like,
Yeah.
just
So kind of backing into that a little bit, because I think one great place to start is long runs, long rides, always first thing I talk about, which is like throw paces out the window. Like you're going in based on effort, and you might be 2-3 minutes a mile off of your standard pace in order to like genuinely feel easy, which is really hard for some people like mentally wrap their heads around there. So, is there anything that you use? And I think this works across both sports, but correct me if I'm wrong. Because I do think it's hard to find the metrics sometimes of like
yeah,
whether you're going into a track session or you're going into a long run of like, all right, because to a certain extent, right, you're like you can do it all right. Like we're talking about New York here. Like I can wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I put myself in like the best position to be successful, and it's still terrible weather.
yeah.
It's hot, it's humid, etc. So when you're going into those sessions, because in essence, like that's your day, and like it's for most of us, like that means that's when it is. You know, are there like certain metrics or ways that you're trying to manipulate that session to be more successful ultimately?
Yeah, I think the metrics that I'm using is listen, every session is going to be successful, right? Like you got out, you worked out, it's success. The understanding is what are you basing your success on? What metric?
Sure.
And
Mhm.
I'm like you know, for running, everything is kind of pace based, right? This is the work
Mhm.
that I want to be doing for this distance. Cycling would be
Yeah.
power based, right? Those are
Sure.
equivalents. This is the work I'm actually doing. Heart rate has
Mhm.
taken a back seat to those, right? It used to be heart rate based training because that was a prediction of the work we're doing. Heart rate can't be ignored, right? I'm a metrics
Sure.
person. I'm a pace person. I am a power person. Like tomorrow, I have a power goal for this whole thing. Like I'll be watching that like a hawk, but I can't
Mhm.
disregard my heart rate.
Mhm.
If let's just say from a running perspective, let's say I'm supposed to be running an 8-minute mile and my heart rate should be 140 when I'm doing that. Well, if I'm out there running an 8-minute mile, my heart rate is at 155. Well, something's not right, right? Like I'm at this pace, I should be 10 beats, 15 beats lower than I currently am. So then you got to stop and say to yourself, well, why is heart rate not the best predictor for us? It's because the heart rate's affected by so many things, not
Sure.
just what I'm doing, but your heart rate. And this is, I kind of talk about this as like your heart rate is the employee in your body. They do everything, right?
Mhm.
They are digesting the cappuccino you had right before you went out for the run, right? All that caffeine, digesting the food
Yeah.
you're taking. It's trying to do heat regulation. It's trying to pump oxygen to the muscles that you're asking to do this VO2 max effort, right? Like it's all this stuff is being asked of this one employee to do. And the fact of the matter is the brain is not recognizing that it's asking all this stuff. The boss is like, no, we're doing this 400 repeat. Like I need you to do this, but the brain's like, but wait a minute, you also asked me to have that double espresso, and you asked me to do this, and you asked me not to have a heat stroke right now, right? It's doing everything, and
Yeah.
all you expect it to do is this one thing. So when I'm in that situation, I see my heart rate is responding much higher than the work I'm asking it to do. I need to then take a step back and say, all right, well, what else is my heart doing right now? Oh, it's 95 degrees outside. It's trying to make sure I don't overheat. So my new
Mhm.
zone is this. I got to rely on my heart rate zone on that day, not my pace zone. So can I still accomplish what I'm trying to get out of that workout So typically a zone 2 or zone 3 or maybe even a zone 4, I'm probably still going to get because we're really thinking about energy system. When we get into those zone 5, zone 6s, maybe I'm not really being able to hit it because maybe I'm not actually going hard enough. I'm not running
Mm.
fast enough or cycling powerfully enough to get my muscles to respond the way that they need to improve. So if my heart rate isn't allowing me to hit some of my fast goal paces for speed work or
Mm.
for power work, then it's better to just not do it because I'm not getting the product I need because the environment's not allowing me to. So that speed work would be better done actually probably inside doing something as an alternative.
Mhm.
So heart rate's really what I'll use as my backup.
Yeah, which is an interesting concept to think about, right? Of like, I feel like so oftentimes we're encouraging people to get outdoors, take the workout to the road, etc. This is actually a really great little like tangent here of, you know, at which point do you encourage the workout to go inside to, to obviously conditions
Controlled.
which you can control, and it's, you know, I'll kind of leave it there a little bit, other than the fact it certainly sounds like maybe some of those key workouts where you really are looking for certain paces or power outputs. But yeah, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah. So let's take a look at this in another way. Think about altitude training, right? When altitude
Sure.
training first came about, the idea was like, oh, I got to go up to Colorado and train up there. And now when you look at altitude training, they're not training at the high altitudes. They're actually training at the low altitudes. And then they're going and living in the high altitudes. Because the problem with the high altitude is less oxygen means I do less work. I can't
Yeah.
perform as well. It's a lot harder to run a 6-minute mile at altitude than it is at sea level. So heat training is the same way. If by working hard I'm going to increase my core temperature, then I want the ideal temperature outside to let me work as hard as I possibly can to get the muscle benefit that I want, the power. Think of it from a power perspective. So I want my workouts to be the best quality they can be. So I want them to be in the ideal environment. Now, how do I then
Mhm.
transfer that to heat? So heat training, back in the day was like, all right, well, let's just make it hot. Let's learn to suffer, right? But the problem with that is our performance goes down because we can't train at an optimal pace or intensity. So now heat training is being looked at as more of like, you know what? Go to the gym, do your speed set on the treadmill. It's not ideal. Of course, we'd love to be outside. There's other reasons for that, but
Sure.
let's do that speed work indoors on the trainer. And then once you're done on the treadmill, you're going to jump right into the sauna
Yeah.
for 20 or 30 minutes while your core temperature is already elevated. Then you jump into the sauna with this elevated core temperature. The body is now going to sit in there trying to figure out how to cool itself down the same way it would be as if you're outside trying to work out. So your body's still learning and getting the adaptation of heat stress and going through the vasodilation and the sweating and all these things of trying to kind of cool itself, but you're not doing it in expense of your actual training, right? So get the quality when you need the quality and get the heat when the heat's best for us to get. And then the outdoor running would be like zone 2, right? Like if I really like, yes, you got to run outside if that's what you're going to do. But if it's a super hot day, I'm going to be better off trying to do a zone 2 type workout than anything else.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to throw one little sidebar for people here. We're not going to go into sauna acclimation protocols, but you bring up an excellent point that both for elevation and for heat adaptation, there are sauna adaptation protocols. This could be a
Whole,
whole nother
yeah.
multi-hour process we go down. Maybe a good one for another day. But if you're interested, you absolutely look into it. Once again, it's for heat acclimation as well as altitude acclimation. These sauna protocols come in. It is interesting, going back to your point there of like zone 2 efforts. One thing I see so often is, with heat impact in particular, the longer the activity, the more opportunity for impact on the workout. So on a running side in particular, which is a little bit more of my sweet spot, I think about like track days, if you will, of 200-meter repeats, 400-meter repeats. You can actually have a really high quality day. When I think about then like long tempo blocks where I want someone to go out and run 8, 9, 10 miles at marathon pace. That's an awfully hard workout on a day that's 90 degrees. I wouldn't expect the person to be able to execute it the same way that they would at a 200-meter level. So then when I think about, let's say, the zone two time, it's going to be a little bit different. Cycling, much easier for the reasons you talked about. Staying, I see a lot of people on the run, and this will come straight from that 100 miler that you did. Like this will be very topical. There is a cardiac drift. The longer the activity, your heart rate, the zones are changing as minutes and hours go by, where it's going to continue to elevate, continue to elevate, and continue to elevate, making it one much more complicated, much more difficult to stay in that kind of low, let's say zone two you're looking for. And then two, at a certain point, that zone is gone. Your body has fatigued enough where like it is setting new zones over the course of a long effort. Brian, you're going to have this issue tomorrow at some point.
Yeah.
So this actually is really a useful way to look at it is, if you're going by power, but also trying to be cognizant of your heart rate, which is crucial over a 12-hour effort. When you're 6, 7 hours into that effort, how are you looking at it? Are you still using power primarily? Are you trying to kind of make an adaptation there based upon a lot of previous racing history, et cetera?
Yeah, some of it in the long stuff when you're getting this cardiac drift, and I'm trying to stay in the zone too. I'm trying to keep it low because I still have hours to go. There's nothing you can do. It is what it is, right? At some point in time, you're just like, all right, well, I got to keep moving forward. Period. And we'll even see this now too with like the whoops and the Garmin's that like see our sleep,
Mhm.
where you'll go to bed at night and your body's still super elevated heart rate and you're still working, right? A lot of that is due. So let's backtrack it to like that 200, that tempo, and then the zone
Yep.
two. If you think about, your point about the 200 is great because yeah, you can actually get a good track day. Why? Because I can take the time in between my intervals to cool down, stand in the shade, put some ice on or stuff like that to cool my body temperature to let me go again. That
Yep.
6, 7, 8, 9 mile tempo run, that's the worst, right? That's the worst because think again
For
about
lots of reasons.
your yeah, your sprint work, right? You're working in that glycolytic kind of
Yeah.
system, and then your zone two work, you're working in that aerobic system. Well, it's that glycolytic system that's really producing all this majority of the heat, right? Because it's muscle based. Sprinting is
Mhm.
really working on that mostly, right? Your tempo is the combination of those two. So with that tempo, I still have a lot of glycolytic activity going on here, right? Where I get to the
Mhm.
zone two, I don't have as much of that glycolytic system, which is why my heart rate's a little bit lower. I can kind of deal with this a little bit. Now, as the event gets longer, longer, and longer, I get muscle fatigue. So now
Mhm.
what's happening is my glycolytic system starting to kind of kick in. That's why my heart rate's popping back up as well. So it's hard. Like I would say, yeah, I kind of forgot where the question was on that, but
Well, so yeah,
um,
if you're kind of like as heart rate is starting to drift later, because I think you can see it even still in to shorten it up from a 12-hour day. Let's say, well, a lot of people are going to be doing a 2+ hour long run, getting ready for your marathon. Get as you're approaching 3 hours. Halfway through for me, the heart rate that I started with is long since gone. I'm now at a very different level. My pace has certainly not gotten faster. As a matter of fact, it's probably gotten slower.
yeah,
My effort is starting to feel a little bit labored. I'm getting tired as I've already run a while.
yeah,
And so it becomes a tricky question where you're like, well, I'm trying to run by heart rate. In essence, what do you do at that point? I mean, I could go all the way down to a walk. My heart rate would settle at that level. But if I'm running, it's going to probably continue to be going up, up, and up. And I think to maybe paraphrase you a little bit, it's maybe two things. One, why very rarely do we use heart rate as a primary metric anymore, which you kind of alluded to, because it's very difficult in that kind of setting to work with. And then, maybe two there to kind of go with it is, and I'm sure you talk about this with your athletes. I certainly do. It's like, I need you to be focusing really on your effort and your real feel, your body feel, as
yeah,
much as anything in the scenario, which is, I've always thought found a little chuckle. This will only entertain like maybe you and two other people in the whole planet. But looking at your heart rate and seeing it elevated is a stressor, which tends to do what? Elevate your heart rate further because you're stressed, you're worried about it. And so I asked a lot of athletes to really put the heart rate away for some of those sessions and really focus on the effort of being genuinely easy, allowing the pace to drop, etc. Because yeah, that heart rate just becomes more and more challenging the longer the workout continues.
Yeah, and then to jump on that, RPE has actually been proven to be the best predictor of anything, right? Is your rate of perceived exertion. And what I'd say is if I was out for my long run, and I'm still hitting my paces, but my heart rate's still a little elevated, and I'm
Yep.
hour 2 in this, and I'm still maintaining, like, fine, keep it. It's okay,
Mhm.
right? I'm still able to do the work that I'm being asked to do. I would I would find it more problematic or concerning is if I'm not hitting my pace and my heart rate is going up. That's when I'd have to slow down, right? That's when I have to really understand, like, okay, I can't maintain that pace right now, and my heart rate is high. Something's going on. Now, if my heart rate's a little
Mhm.
high, but I'm still maintaining this marathon pace at a relative RPE that's acceptable, I'm not at a 10, then I'm fine. I can kind of continue on. You're just tired, hot, and hungry. So, because it's going to happen, right? Obviously, the last hour of any long run is going to be hard, regardless of how easy you try to make it. It's going to be hard.
Yep. Um, that sounds about right. So, well, let's pivot this a little bit. So, I think on a training perspective, I think just to do a super fast recap, in a way, it's like less complicated than sometimes we make it. It's like reframing expectation, right? Like focusing on RPE, allowing the actual like metrics to sort of take a backseat to the effort level, and then just kind of enduring a bit as well. To your final point there of it's not going to get more comfortable as the run gets longer and more likely, but you do want to keep adjusting your effort to try to keep it nice and easy. So in pivoting that, so there are obviously races in very hot weather conditions. So not to like jump ahead on it, but I've got to imagine you would start off by saying you still have to adjust your expectations of those races. But I'd be curious when going into some like a race situation more particularly, if you would adjust it the same, if you would adjust it less, if there are markers you would be looking at more particularly than just in a typical training day, because it's not really that opportunity of like, well, today we'll just like take it easy instead. Or maybe it is, but I'll turn it over
Yeah.
if
So first, I would have to define is it a race or is it a race or an event?
sure.
Okay, because that's really the deciding factor. Like tomorrow for me is an event. I'm not
Yeah.
here to win place or to do anything other than go at my physical limit.
Hmm.
Now, there are different times when I'm racing. I want to win. That's my goal, right? So when that's the situation, then I have to throw all metrics out the window. I have to do what the race prescribes me to do, right? If that group is going and I'm looking at my heart rate or my power and be like, well, I really shouldn't go because I don't think I can handle that. Well, what the hell does it matter? Because the race is up the road anyway. So you might as well
Sure.
go blow up and then end up in last place instead of just being left to last place, right? Because
Yeah.
you made a decision. So racing, I kind of throw all of it out the window, to be honest. I'm just like, all right, it is what it is. I'm going to go until my body can't go anymore. And then
Hmm.
that's it. Now, if I think it's a long race, 100-mile race or something like that, and let's say I do want to win, I still have to kind of think of those things because the fact of the matter is I got to get there as fast as I can get there. And if I think
Yeah.
that group ahead of me is going to blow up because it's hot and they're a bunch of 20-year-old kids that are like, we're going to blow this away. All right.
Yeah.
Well, if they blow up in 30 miles, I'll see them again. So,
Sure.
my expectations, I always come to my expectations first of like, okay, I think I can hold, for me, let's say tomorrow, like, all right, I'm going to hold 200 watts per hour for 15 hours. Like, that's going to be my goal. And then I wake up. The first thing I do is I actually look at the dew point. So I don't look at the
Okay.
temperature. I don't look at the humidity. I actually look at dew point because dew point's a really good measure of how much like water's in the air itself, and depending on the dew point, will have a direct correlation of how well you're going to do. If that dew point is above 65, well, I know that my 200-watt goal needs to come down somewhere, right? Maybe it's 5% or 10%. If that dew point's up around 75, like forget about it. Like everything's out the window. And it's like,
Okay.
I'll do what I can do when I can do it. If that dew point's down in the 50s, high 50s, low 60s, okay, race is on. I'm going for that 200. I'm going to hold it as long as I can, right? So I would be foolish to say that the temperature doesn't impact my race decisions, right? Because it
Mm-hmm.
certainly does.
Yep.
But depending on the situation, I just might have racer brain and say, forget about it. I'm following the rabbit.
Okay. Well, it's a great point too. It's like heat and humidity are very separate things. So a dry, 80 and a moist 70 are very different. Our body responds very differently.
And
Humidity,
cloud coverage,
sure, yeah,
UV index, all that play. For me personally, heat and humidity don't affect me nearly as much as the sun. If it's sunny out and I feel like I'm baking and I'm getting that radiant heat, I melt. It could be mental. It could just be that I feel like I'm gonna just overheat and die. My head feels like it's gonna explode. So like doing a race in Hawaii is not on my hot list. Like I don't
sure.
want to be, or in like Arizona. Like tomorrow could be a nightmare for me if the sun comes out and I'm just in these
Yeah.
barren fields for hours on end. And but that then comes to how am I preparing for that from a clothing perspective? Am I covering my skin? Am I using sunblock? Things of that nature. So all that, man, there's so many things you got to think of. Sucks.
Yeah. Well, and I think maybe just to close the racing, because to go back to it, just trying to pull a few things out of what you're talking about. I think in a way similar to some of those workouts we were saying, where the longer the race, obviously, once again, the more impact heat has on it, the more calculated things you have to do. So when I think about, let's say, the 100-mile bike rides or 200-mile bike rides, but even, hundreds, 50s, 60s, things where you're going to be out there like multiple hours, the marathon, even the half marathon. Just want to bring up what you illustrated, which is if you're racing, whether it's time goal, whether it's versus a group of people, you've got to be thoughtful that that is a long race, and just because someone pulls away early doesn't mean that they're going to be there late. As a matter of fact, like the longer the race, the bigger of an opportunity to kind of catch them down the road. um, to tell a teeny bit of a story is like last year I was doing 50-mile ultra race up in New Paltz, New York, and we were with this group, and I was running with another Team Wilbur's athlete, and he was real eager to chase these two guys that were right ahead of us, and I was like reining him back, reining him back, reining him back. Well, we saw those guys. We saw those guys about 30 miles into a 50-mile race, where that was the first time we passed them. And then we never saw them again. We didn't see them again for the rest of the race. We didn't see them at the after party. We were long gone by the time that those guys might have gotten to the finish line. So the longer the race, much more thoughtful about being kind of focused in your own mind. I think for most of our athletes, we're really kind of racing against ourselves and our time goals. So yeah, the heat impacts us all. But so I want to kind of jump straight into it because you were starting to allude to, and it's exactly where I want to kind of go and ultimately finish out here. Is so there are some things you can do outside of just like adjusting effort level. Both technology of science has allowed some interventions, both in apparel, in nutritional insight in terms of hydration, fueling, etc. So let's talk about the things that really are in our control, because you don't get to say what happens tomorrow if the clouds do part and you're in direct UV all day. So what are the things you're doing when you're going out for your workouts? It's going to be tough conditions. We're going to say, for the sake of conversation, that it's a race situation, so you don't get to modify the course, you don't get to modify the workout. What are the things that you're bringing in with it to really like make the conditions more manageable for yourself?
Yeah. So I'll start again. The prep of this started 2 days ago with drinking. Just making
Okay.
sure my hydration levels every day are not dipping,
You're
especially with
referring to
travel,
water.
flying, water. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Alcohol is actually, you definitely want to avoid alcohol. That's definitely for sure. Um, it, it- it's not going to benefit us. So a lot of
Yeah.
liquid, non-alcoholic liquid if preference. So, and the same thing with electrolytes and sodium and stuff. Like I want to kind of increase that during this time as much as possible.
Mhm.
Now let's get into like the actual race event stuff like that. The morning of, right? Again, this is all about how do I keep my core temperature the coolest. I want to be cold. So a lot of
Yep.
us, a lot of times these things start early in the morning and people are cold and they're putting on jackets and things like that. And they're trying to stay warm. I'm like, F that, man. I know in 3 hours, this place is going to be 100 degrees. Like, if I can get a little bit of hypothermia right now, like, let's roll with it. Like, so what are some ways I can kind of cool my body temperature down? You see people with ice vests and things like that at some of these races, and that's a great way, obviously to do that. Drinking water hasn't really been shown to really cool your core temperature down, but drinking ice drinks like slushies and things
Mhm.
like that, like crushed
Yep.
ice, does cool down. Ice pops and things like that. So if it's a hot morning, you'll see me with those ice pops that you'd have as a kid,
Mhm.
or some sort of drink like that in the morning instead of like my normal kind of sport drink that I'd be sipping
Mhm.
on. Because again, if I can get the chills, all for it. During the
Yep.
race, it's about mitigating radiant heat. I don't want to absorb anything that the ground or the sun is giving to me, right? So
Mhm.
I have a tendency to wear white long sleeve type tops. If I'm running and cycling, I'll wear like a sun sleeve, something I can wet that will also help me cool. But all those things need to be like SPF 50 and above, right? I want to block the UV rays from coming in. Sometimes I don't like to have my skin covered for some reason. I want a little bit more flow over top. So then I'll do sunblock, but sunblock people react differently to it. Some people it affects how they sweat and things of that nature. So that's a 50-50. But clothing, I think, is really important, right? Trying to wear a light color, something that breathes easily, but something that's going to give me an SPF protection. Not just something that's light, but something that's actually going to block the rays. And then it's trying to cool my body, you know, keeping water on myself if I can. If it's super hot and I'm sweaty, like, okay, I can keep dumping water on myself. It's probably not going to help necessarily. Cold water on me is probably going to help, right? Because it's going to help. The cold water will act as um, conduction. Yeah, conduction, right? That'll actually start to cool itself down a little bit. So just trying to keep that going, and then controlling my efforts. Again, if I feel like I'm starting to overheat, I start to feel pressure in my head or my ears or nausea and stuff like that. It's like, okay, you just got to pull back, keep drinking like crazy. If, that's a whole nother debate about how much you should drink on thirst or on a plan and stuff of that nature. So that's something you got to learn on your own, how much sodium you use and stuff like that. That's a conversation for an athlete and a coach, or an athlete and nutritionist to have, not for an athlete to have with another athlete. So I'm a big believer in, like, you do you when it comes to that. Just make a educated educated choice based on you, not based on your training buddy. Um, and then
Or internet.
afterwards, or internet. Um, and then afterwards, it's about cooling myself, right? Or during the race, if it's one of these long races. I mean, we've all seen the people doing Death Valley Run where they're like shoving themselves into a cooler.
Yeah.
At these checkpoints, like I said, I only have the opportunity to see my crew 2 times during this race. But you'd be very sure that my crew is sitting there with bags and bags of ice. Like, that ice is not there to keep my drinks cold. That ice is there for me, that if I feel like I'm overheating at that point in time, where I'm just going to lay down on the bags of ice and they'll pack my body in ice the same way you would if your kid had a fever, right? Get into a cold tub, put ice on them. Like, got to get this core temperature down, because once the core temperature gets to a number, one, heat stroke or like heat exhaustion, we obviously don't want that. But once your once your body temperature starts getting to that thermostat level, you're gonna shut down. your body's going to slow down. So if I can, for 15 minutes, get that core temperature back down, well, great. I got all that time to get that core temperature to come back up again. I can probably make it to the next checkpoint and then ice myself to death. So if you're at a race where they have ice every mile, ice up on your head, ice down your shorts. And I know it doesn't seem comfortable, but like ice down in the crotch area cools big time. Ice socks and things like that. So like, yeah, just trying to keep my body as cool as possible. Everything I can do.
Fair. I think about two things you brought up. I just would be curious to like have you expound upon a little bit. So we really only have a few things, right? It's like, yeah, we use either some sort of fluid or ice to try to keep our body cold. We can adjust our effort. We have our apparel. So, you're talking about like keeping your skin covered to prevent the UV, et cetera. And then the two main things that I think probably are most accessible to like to everybody is you have fluid, which you talked about, and then fuel. And so I kind of was starting on fluid, but in essence, I'll kind of will be curious on both. Is so drink to thirst is definitely my favorite strategy, and we won't go into exactly what that is, but there are two things that come with fluid levels, right? You've got like hyponatremia, too much fluid, too low sodium, dehydration. Dehydration, everybody talks about dehydration, everyone's worried about dehydration. The other
No,
one, much more dangerous by about 100 times. Like it's very unlikely you become so dehydrated, not impossible, very unlikely so dehydrated in the course of a race if you did the prehydration that Brian's talking about, that you become into issues. Hyponatremia, very possible if you get it. You see it all the time, especially in these ultra endurance events, the Ironmans, etc., where people are overhydrating without balancing electrolytes. So I'll take my long road to a short question. When you're going into these hot weather conditions, are you modifying the actual fluid you're drinking as what away from water to something like electrolyte formula or a sports drink, or sticking with things that are more traditional?
no, but I'm probably an outlier.
Yeah.
This would be one of my soapbox things, like hyponatremia, dehydration. Right? When you look at those two, dehydration, there's never been a death that occurred in any endurance sport where hydration is readily available. Right? So this is not
Sure.
running across the desert, right? So if there's a hose or aid stations along the way, the chances of you getting to a dangerous point of dehydration are about slim to none. And some would argue that the people who
Yep.
finish first are more dehydrated than anybody else. Hyponatremia is definitely something we have to worry about. Hyponatremia is not the lack of sodium in our system, it's the too much water in our system, right? So the whole electrolyte game was sports
Dilution.
marketing. Yes.
Yep.
And we cannot drink enough sodium to water ratio for us to actually balance that in our body. So regardless of what you drink, if it has sodium in it or not, you are hydrating your body without sodium, right? Like you're not keeping that thing the same. And our sweat has more liquid in it than does sodium. Even if you're a salty sweater like myself, I will be covered in white. And the reason I'm covered in white is because I already have a high sodium level in my system to begin with. So my body's just getting rid of what it necessarily does not need. And if you do sodium testing, which go for it, people should do it. Like again, each to their own. What I would encourage you to do is to test your sodium sweat level in the beginning of a 2-hour run, or 3-hour run, but also test it at the very end as well, because your concentration of sodium changes as the event gets longer. We lose less
Yep.
sodium later on in the event. So technically our sodium concentration in our body is actually rising as we're working out. And then we take in water, which is why we're thirsty, right? To help balance out the sodium level to kind of balance that. So that's a huge wormhole. Hyponatremia is definitely something we need to be worried about. But hyponatremia is usually the result of somebody having an underlying condition where their body does not. There's a hormone, I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but it's basically this imbalance where your brain doesn't get the understanding like that your bladder is full, that you actually have enough liquid in you. And it's more common in these ultra endurance events because of the fear of dehydration, people drink on a scheduled basis instead of a need basis, and they end up overhydrating themselves. So it does
Yeah.
occur. I had an athlete that ended up in a coma at Ironman Mount Tremblant a couple years ago, and this is a guy who works in cardiac rehab at Columbia. Like, this kid knows what he's doing. He just has this underlying condition, and he ended up in the hospital, had to be medevaced from there back to Columbia. He was in a coma for a week due to this, right? So it's there. It's something we have to think about. Most of us probably don't have to concern ourselves too much about it, but you have to separate your hydration with your nutrition plan on super hot days. You have to kind of, if like tomorrow, a lot of my nutrition is going to come in through fluid.
Okay.
Now, if I'm going to have this idea of like, all right, well, I'm drinking 200 calories per hour per bottle, and then all of a sudden tomorrow's super hot and I start finding myself going through a bottle and a half or 2 bottles. Well, now all of a sudden I might be taking in way too much calories and fluids. I'm going to have these other issues. So, I have to say to myself, all right, well, tomorrow I'm drinking X amount of nutrition and I'm drinking X amount of just plain water on hand as well. So you do have to have a nutrition and hydration plan based on the temperature. If it's 60 degrees outside, I'm not going to drink as much. If it's 110 degrees outside, I'm going to drink a lot more. So if my calories are associated with that, you got to make sure you dilute it or you strengthen it to make sure you're getting the proper calories for that event as well. But hydration, this is definitely a topic that we could have a 3-hour conversation on. What I can tell people is what you probably grew up learning is probably the opposite of what is true, and educate yourself on it.
Well, I find it a fascinating topic. So, this will resonate for you. One of the biggest athletic training books I've ever seen was by Dr. Timothy Noakes, who
Mm-hmm.
introduced this like hydration, extra hydration science to athletes originally. I think maybe even all the way back in Florida, like creation of Gatorade, et cetera. But he was
Yeah.
huge into hydrating athletes. And then he came along maybe like a decade or two later and wrote another humongous book that's like this thick called Waterlogged, that we were
Yeah.
just tremendously overhydrating athletes. And did an entire retort of what he had originally reported. So we're still we're still trying to find the truth of this. We're somewhere in the middle at the moment, but it's kind of interesting how it's a relatively new science. I mean, sports science is just kind of touched on at such a small level. So we'll keep finding
Yeah.
out information here.
Yeah. Just remember that most of the information that we get through periodicals, magazines, internet, and stuff like that, most of the stuff that we get is sports marketing driven, not research marketing driven, right? So like a lot of, I used to work for a pharmaceutical company as a drug rep for a while, and one of the things is how much money does that company spend on research, but what they do not disclose is the difference between scientific research and market research, right? So it's the same thing when you look at like the Gatorade Institute. What are they really studying there, right? Like,
Yeah.
so you have to remember that it's business. The supplement industry in this world is, I mean, billions and billions of dollars. Again, I'm not saying I'm for it or against it, and I think certain people have certain plans. I think you just need to make sure that you're making an educated decision on your hydration and fluid needs and electrolyte needs, not just something that, Gatorade or salt tabs told you to do, right? It was one of those things of, and Tim Noakes talks about this in Waterlogged. It's like, all right, so they created a hydration issue, right? So then what do they do? Is like, well, we'll just add sodium. The balance is off. It's not like, oh, I gave you water toxicity here. I gave you too much water. Now we've diluted the sodium so much. So the response for them wasn't like, hey, let's just not give so much water and let everything be okay. It's like, all right, well, I gave you this much water, which means now I have to give you this much sodium as well to rebalance the thing. So, and that's the problem. And too much sodium can also be an issue. A lot of people, especially in Ironman stuff like this and long distance events, you start GI issues.
Hmm.
So sodium can definitely affect how the water is processed to your gut and intestines. So having too much sodium can be a cause of a lot of the GI issues that people are having, which is why I was like, you got to come up with a plan that works for you and that you've tested in a variety of conditions: hot weather, cold weather, running, cycling, all this stuff. Swimming is very problematic because of that conduction. You don't realize how hot you are or how much you're technically sweating when you're swimming
Yeah.
because the water's passing over you. It gives you that illusion. And then you stop and all of a sudden you're sweating to death, right? Like, so yeah, informed decisions is the best decision. Just get the
Well, in
right
our final,
information.
we're getting to the end of our time. So there's one final piece of this nutritional pie, because we talked obviously a lot about the hydration, the good, the bad, the in between, and ultimately it comes back down to like experiment, find the thing that works for you, which is what it is. But we haven't quite touched as much on the fueling aspect of it, which my opinion at least changes a little bit as the temperature rises. Like a hot body, higher heart rate, carbohydrate consumption in terms of energy expenditure increases. Technically, the need of carbohydrate intake increases. Brian, once again, this is a great example because you're going into this tomorrow. Are you calculating when you're thinking about just your fuel intake, you're a different strategy based upon hot weather versus ideal weather conditions?
Yeah. It's yes. Not the not carbohydrate versus other. It's always carbohydrate for me, right? It's
Yep.
always
Sure.
carbohydrate.
Yep.
So the decision that I'll make though is how solid is the food.
Mm. Okay.
Because solid food, the harder the food is, the more dense the food is, the more blood required to break down that food, right?
Hmm.
So that's why, like when you're doing something intense, a 10K or a very fast half marathon, you're probably not eating solid food. You're sticking to gels and liquids.
Yep.
As the race gets longer, 50K, 50 miles, 100 miles, solid food comes into because you're not working as hard, your heart rate's lower, so that way you
Hmm.
can spare blood. Again, your heart rate is doing everything, right? So if I can spare blood to my stomach to break down food, then I can go ahead with that. In a hot condition, regardless of how fast I'm going, that blood is now going to my surface of my skin to help with a cooling function. So if I'm already diverting blood to my skin to help cool me, which means that that blood's not going to my working muscles that need it for the activity. I can't afford to divert more blood to my stomach to start breaking down, the Cliff Bar I just ate. So I got to keep this into a liquid or a semi-soft food because I need the digestion process to be as easy on my heart as possible. Now, is that good for my palate? Do I love that? No, but the fact of the matter
Yeah.
is, you just got to shove it down, right? You're just like, all right, well, this is what it's going to be because it has to be. So I do change my fueling plan based on heat, based on blood flow, and how solid the food would be.
Okay. Yeah, I sort of feel across the board in this general nutritional thing. I'm not sure I've ever found a topic that's like been more different person to person in sport. You mentioned the taste preference, the digestibility, which what works for me might absolutely not work for you. I've seen some crazy things that work for some people, while similarly, like I wouldn't even fathom it, and good for them to each their own. It's why anything, and certainly what I try to like drill into one-on-one clients I'm working with is like experimentation early, often, making sure looking what's on the course, deciding if you're going to use it, deciding if you need to carry everything personally. These are huge make or break issues in these kind of warm conditions, but especially as we get into longer endurance efforts, that fueling is such a big part of it, and even more so in the extreme conditions.
Yeah, things that work for you are the best things. And that's the things you got to
Mhm.
try them. Like I always say with sports scientists don't study something and then coaches and athletes do it.
Yeah.
Basically, somebody runs really fast or bikes really fast, and then the scientists study why that happens. They were
Yeah.
already doing the thing that made them fast, right? And then the scientists try to figure out why. So that's when you get into like nutrition and stuff too. It's kind of like, listen, if it works for you, anecdotally, it works for you. You've done this, it
Yeah.
works. Like you don't need necessarily the science to tell you it works. You know it works. It worked. Now, is there something
Mhm.
better out there? Maybe, but there could also be something a lot worse. So that's why, yeah, it's trial and error. Like I did, like everything I'm doing tomorrow in this race, I've practiced in
Mhm.
the last month. I did a 12-hour mountain bike race where I practiced some nutrition there. Could I stomach a certain volume of food? That was really what I was practicing at that point in time. And then 2 weeks later, I did a 100-mile, 8-hour ride with one of the other coaches, Greg Wagner.
Mhm.
And I tried my exact plan, like the same hydration pack, the same drink, the same gels I'm going to use. And I was trying to eat on the same time frame I was going to use. And it was a almost successful, right? I was like, hour 6, hour 7, I was like, okay, this doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
But that then led me to say, okay, well, now I know what I need to change for race day. In theory, it's worked in the past, wasn't working this time. So, and you got to be ready. Like Mike Tyson says, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the nose, right?
Yeah.
Tomorrow at hour 5 or hour 6, something could happen where I'm just like, all right, this isn't working anymore, which is why the education is so important. Because when something isn't going right, and I'm standing in that checkpoint area and I have, a buffet of stuff in front of me, and I realize my current strategy is not going to work for the next 5 hours. Well, I can't just stick with that current strategy. It's not going to work. I need to sit there and
Right.
think for a moment and be like, all right, well, what's my other options here? What can my plan be? Which is why I think education about this is so important. We just can't kind of follow a plan. We need to understand what it is we're trying to accomplish and what's happening. So that way, when stuff gets bad, we can make a decision on what we can try next, educated decision, or having an
Well,
educated crew member.
in an interesting way, and this we'll tidy it up here, but our bodies are really incredible about letting us know what we want as well. This will go to the experimentation piece. So you mentioned it being a very heavy like salt sweater. It might be that your body ends up craving salt. And there was a sports nutritionist based out of Colorado. It works with a lot of like ultra runners out there, and she has this gas station test for her ultra runners. When the whole point of it is not to find out like what you had and what the strategy is to take half of their long run, conclude that halfway mark at a gas station where they are able to buy the contents of a convenience store. And
Mhm.
immediately, when posed with that situation, and this makes me think of those like buffet tables for ultra events, you will immediately gravitate towards what
What you
you're
need.
craving. Whether it's sweet, if you're in need of carbohydrates, if it's salt, if you need something that's a bit more savory. It's a really interesting opportunity to learn something about yourself and what your body craves, and it might be different day to day. It might be different based upon your prep. It might be based upon the condition. But putting yourself in those situations often, kind of experimenting with different things, that's really how you're going to figure out what your body ultimately tends to want, because it will be similar. I'm the same. I'm a sweat monster. Like I just lose salt like crazy. And if I can start having like salty things late in the race, like I know that those are going to suit me very well. But you have to kind of do that from time to time, take yourself to like a limit, and then see really what you are craving.
Yeah, I love gas stations. I'll
Makes
meet you at a gas
for
station any
great
day.
dining options.
Yes.
Well, perfect. Well, on that note, I told you we wrap it up for everyone's sake here ahead of 60 minutes. So, Brian, I really appreciate the time and expertise, and wish you an incredible amount of success in the Unbound. We'll definitely be following along via your social media. Speaking of social media, what's the best way for people to track you, over the next few days and ongoing?
Yeah, so it is at truefitnyc.com. That's TRUFITNYC. Um, yeah. Well, without the .com, that's the website. It's just at
Great.
TrueFitNYC.
Well, thanks again, Brian. Thanks to everyone for watching. Hopefully, this is helpful, and we'll do it again sometime soon. But have a great one,
All right.
Brian.
Thanks, man. Bye.